Hello, everyone. Welcome back. About 2 weeks ago, we dropped the deep dive episode on heavy metal with guest illustrator and friend of the show, Brett Kelley. And if you love that discussion, or if you just can't get enough of this cult classic, I've got a little treat for you today because we're going to be doing our standalone trivia segment with some really fun behind the scenes facts, sneaky details, and insane production notes. And trust me, after this, if you have not seen or heard our episode, you're going to want to go back and listen to that full episode. We dive into a ton of facts. So if you're listening to this and thinking like, this is not the trivia I would have covered, it's probably because we already covered it in the episode. We covered a lot of trivia. We're also going to do something a little bit different as far as the way the trivia normally goes. I usually just go 1, 2, 3, count out the trivia, but I'm going to ask you in the form of a question first and give you a little pause so that you can jump in and maybe guess your answer, say what you think. There are a lot of fans of this movie. People have really been reaching out. I think the response is great. So let's play a little game here. Question number 1. When heavy metal first hit U.S. newsstands, how much did it cost? The answer, $1.50 per copy, which doesn't sound like very much now, but at the time that was actually on the higher end of comic pricing. This wasn't like a cheap throwaway pulp buy. It was a very glossy paper, full color artwork. It was kind of positioning itself as something closer to a collectible magazine than a disposable comic book or magazine. Even from the jump, heavy metal was kind of trying to tell us exactly what it was. Premium, provocative, and not for kids, not a dime novel. Question number 2. What is the name of Taarna's giant flying steed? Okay, this one's kind of a trick question. In the original movie, the creature is never actually named. No character says its name. The movie itself doesn't ever identify it as having a name. However, later licensing and merchandise, the character guide has it called avis, which comes from the Latin word for bird. So depending on how deep your trivia rabbit hole goes, both answers are technically correct. In the movie itself, it's unnamed. In later materials, it is called avis. This is the kind of sneaky detail that can spark surprisingly heated discussions amongst diehard fans. Number 3. Why was it so hard to get a copy of this film on VHS or Laserdisc when it first came out? And we kind of spoke about this a bit in the episode, but we didn't really dive into it into a level of detail that I wanted to do. I wanted to circle back because I really think this is worth knowing. It's a bit of the wild part of heavy metal's legacy and really contributes, in my opinion, to how it became such a cult film. When the film came out in 1981, like we spoke about, the soundtrack was incredibly stacked. We had Black Sabbath, Cheap Trick, Journey, Blue Oyster Cult, Sammy Hagar, Devo, Stevie Nicks, Dan Felder. I'm sure I'm missing. There's probably more. There's definitely more. But here's where it gets complicated. Those tracks weren't background decoration. They were the core of the movie's identity, and each one had its own separate licensing deal. The original contracts cleared the songs for theatrical exhibition and for soundtrack album release, but not for video formats like VHS and Laserdisc. That meant that Columbia couldn't legally sell it on tape without renegotiating music rights for every single artist and label, and that would be really time-consuming and incredibly expensive and exceptionally legally tangled. In fact, some songs that you hear in the movie don't even appear on the soundtrack album because they did not have that kind of licensing. They really just had the licensing to use it for the film, and that's it. Because of that, heavy metal became one of the cult films you could really only see if you caught it late night on HBO or Cinemax. Like, you had to catch it on cable or hunt down a bootleg VHS or find somebody who knew somebody. And that meant that copies of copies were traded at weird VHS collector prices. It made this like phenomenon about having it. If you were a person who had it, you were really cool. Even if you knew somebody who had it, that was really cool because you couldn't just go online and find it. You couldn't even really go online and see images at that time. You just had to go on what your friend told you if they had seen it. It wasn't until 1996, which is a full 15 years after its original release, that the official VHS and Laserdisc version comes out, after rights were finally resolved, and that's in part because Kevin Eastman, who we spoke about in the episode, had acquired Heavy Metal magazine in the early 90s, and he helped negotiate settlements with the music copyright holders. And so for the longest time, owning Heavy Metal wasn't really about owning that specific movie because you needed to own that specific movie. It was like a status symbol. You were a legend if you had it. And that helped make the movie more of a cult legend, in my opinion. And speaking of the soundtrack, what milestone did the soundtrack of this movie set? Perhaps not surprisingly, the Heavy Metal soundtrack became bigger than the movie itself. It went platinum in the United States and sold over 1 million copies. And while the magazine and the concept were all about alternative counterculture stories and illustrations, the weird, edgy boundary pushingness of the magazine, the soundtrack is undeniably the most sought after reason people come to this movie. And that's for good reason. We spoke about this in the last comment, last trivia. The music doesn't just accompany the film, it defines it. It's built into it so much that you could not sell the movie without the music in it. And so for a lot of fans, the soundtrack wasn't just part of the experience, it becomes the experience, and then the movie is secondary to the soundtrack. That's pretty transcendent. Number 5. The iconic warrior Taarna wasn't just drawn from imagination. What animation technique was used, and what performer was used for that technique? We spoke about this a little bit in the episode too, but we didn't mention the actress. Portions of Taarna were rotoscoped. They were filmed using Canadian model Carol Desbins in costume, and then they traced over all of her movements frame by frame. This allowed for a lot of complex movement and consistency across that movement to be done very quickly, which was a key thing here because it was a real-time crunch. It also means that if you're super into Taarna, she does exist somewhere in some time. That was a real woman. They took the drawing that they had of her from their artist and then brought it to Canadian modeling agencies. And they said, we're looking for someone over about 6 feet tall who would match this. And they were matched up with Carol. And it worked out pretty well, in my opinion. Number 6. In the Taarna segment, what was rotoscoped to make the bizarre skeleton overlaying the pump station in the beginning sequence? This one's just a bizarre one. Let's have a little bizarre whimsy at the end. That creature was made by a miniature artist named Jerry Allen, who worked on most of the landscapes that were rotoscoped for this scene. He built it from badger bones, a dog skull, and a human spine, and a bit of gumption. They were all made in a studio, which was his studio, which was a Quonset hut near his Long Beach home. And the result is incredibly bizarre and haunting and fits perfectly into the world's aesthetic. But I feel like everything about that and how it got made is bizarre and a little bit haunting, and it shows in the sauce. And that's your Heavy Metal trivia fix. If these little behind-the-scenes stories got you buzzing, well, go check out the full episode with Brett Kelley. We dive a lot deeper into the making of the movie, the music, the visuals, all the chaos behind bringing this cult classic to life. There was so much fun trivia that we got into that it left me with only a little bit here to give you today. So please go check that out, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in.
You skipped it, you dissed it, you said it's a bore. But what if that film's got a little bit more? What if I don't like it? What if it's bad? What if it's awkward or lazy or sad? But what if it's genius, a total surprise? What if it's gold when I open my eyes? We're watching the films you love to avoid. Now sit down and deal with your cinephile void. What